Hello, hello. Welcome to this panel on infrastructure in our Together track. I really hope that you all enjoy the presentation by Celeste Winners a few minutes ago. It was very, if you haven't, I recommend you to come back to the recording whenever they're available. It was a very empowering way of looking at how municipalities interact with communities and give us, for us, who are the activists, side, a very this was very empowering and uplifting to see this dynamic. So anyway, so today my name is Thomas Regan-Lefebvre and I'm the coordinator at Transport Hartford at the Center for Latino Progress. We have the pleasure to have us a group of panelists, and I'm going to start with Congressman Larson, and then we have Randal Davis from the city of Hartford, Mark Morehouse and Kevin Burnham from FHI Studio and City DOT, and Jackie Mandyck from Hartford 400/I-Quilt. Thank you very much for you all. I mean, we've gone through an incredible week in terms of infrastructure. I mean, last week on Monday, President signed this enormous bill for federal investment in the entire state, in our country. And I think the question that I would like to ask you all and you all is, how do you see communities getting involved in this process? How do you think that we are at a point where we need to rethink a little bit interaction between communities and decision makers that go beyond just consultations or polls and so on, but to have some structure, permanent structure, where actually communities can actually interact and be in a way that they can actually oversee, design, and overview a project. So it's my question to you all, and I think Congressman Larson will have to go before the end of this panel. So maybe Congressman Larson can actually start by addressing this panel. Many thanks. Congressman Larson?
Oh, well, thank you, Thomas, and the Center for Latino Progress and Transport Hartford for hosting this conference, and for hosting this, I guess, is your fourth annual, and I think this is just a fantastic idea, and I'm pleased to be joined by Randal, Michael, Kevin, and Jackie in this important. I apologize in advance. I know that my staff had indicated that I've got to run off to another event and meeting, but nonetheless, I really wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to talk about, as you alluded to, Thomas, the infrastructure bill that was just passed, and the Build Back Better America that the House just passed and is now sitting in the Senate waiting to pass as well. So the meeting of this year's Multimodal Transit Summit couldn't be more timely. This historic legislation was a major win for the city of Hartford and the capital region. I have often said that I thought the Biden administration must have had Hartford in mind when they put forward their proposal. Connecticut will receive more than $6 billion to rebuild our highways, bridges, public transit, and more. This package also includes $1 billion to reconnect neighborhoods like Hartford's North End, which, as all of you know on the panel, was cut off with the construction during the Eisenhower administration of 84 and 91. My good friend Steve Harris refers to North Hartford as the 06120, the poorest zip code in the state of Connecticut. And this funding will allow us to address New England's #1 bottleneck. And that's a point I want to emphasize here. First and foremost, let me give a tremendous amount of credit to Governor Lamont and Commissioner Giletti. They have been working with us hand in glove throughout this process. To your point, and apropos of the question, I'm glad that Jackie Mandyck is on the line in Hartford 400, because again, it was that local input, but mostly a vision that's been, well, trying to be fulfilled for more than 50 years in recapturing our riverfront. The Connecticut River, as you know, is the only blueways designated river in this country, and yet both the capital city of Hartford and East Hartford, because of the mixmaster, were cut off from access to this very vital river. And all that represents, not only recreationally and for its beauty, but what it means to commerce and what it means to growth in this greater Hartford community. That in the bisecting of the 06120 and North Hartford have really isolated North Hartford from the rest of the community. And the Etna Viaduct and how that has really hurt business development in this region as well. And of course, in my hometown of East Hartford, the Mixmaster, which has displaced whole communities and of course has cut off our main street from access to the river and economic growth as well. But on the passage of this bill, the 20 million that is necessitated to guarantee the completion of the study that Commissioner Giletti is already undertaking is incredible. And I think there's going to be a continued need for us to have listening tours, et cetera, because of all the very valuable ideas there, where we have an isolated community in the North End now become a gateway for economic opportunity and being reconnected to the riverfront and no longer separated from the rest of the city. At one point, North Hartford was a thriving business community, but since this highway system has cut it off, it's difficult to even find a grocery store in North Hartford. In fact, many would say that it's a food desert. So this represents a tremendous opportunity for the region. And there also is going to be additional opportunity to competitively bid. Now, I say competitively, competition based on the need. Let's be clear about what the need is. We are the #1 chokehold in the state of Connecticut, the #1 chokehold in New England, the #3 worst chokehold in the nation for truck traffic, a major source of pollution for this area and backup. And depending upon who you listen to, the number 11 or 30th worst chokehold in the country. And when you add to that the position of our levees, which around the Buckley Bridge are experiencing something called sandpiping, which was the very thing that brought down the levees in New Orleans. It's a constant and consistent erosion from underneath the levees that we put up there. And a flooding of that nature would be catastrophic to this region, and so has to be avoided. So we rise with all of these issues to a point of urgency that will allow us the opportunity to get the additional funding that we need to coincide with this study that's going on. And as your title indicates, multimodal, that means making sure that we're not only connecting by way of highway for automobile and bus and truck commerce, but also by way of rail and what we have to do and the monies that are available in both Build Back Better and also within the infrastructure plan to expand rail, but expand rail in the way that it works together. And significantly in this region, making sure that we're connecting Springfield and New Haven and Boston and New York, and having busways out to stores, and making sure that everything is focused around the hub of Hartford and of course our airport at Bradley. And to those ends, we have Congressman Neal in Massachusetts, who shares that same passion of making sure that we're collecting our rail systems both to Bradley, but also so that in the future we will have fast track capability to Boston, fast track capability to New York as well. So the good news is this is the most significant infrastructure development since the New Deal. And now the question is, and it starts with the need, and we more than qualify for the need, but then you have to make sure you've completed this with the right kind of articulation and combination of all the multimodal transportation, and whether it's bike path or walking, whether it's automobile, bus, whether it's train or plane, we want to make sure that they're all coordinated in a manner that will both open up commerce, open up opportunity, and of course, deal with climate change and pollution that this region has suffered with over time. So let me commend you again for the tremendous effort that you've done here today in putting on this conference. And the panelists that you have on this group are far more intelligent and capable than I am, but certainly I look to follow up with everybody on your proposals and join with Commissioner Gialetti as we do other listening tours, et cetera, as we take this money and put it into action. This isn't going to happen overnight, but over the next decade, this will come true so that this region will no longer be paralyzed in the way that it's been since the 1950s. And with that, again, I want to thank you, Thomas, and I apologize that I have to get off and leave, but I wanted to thank you and the Center for Latino Progress and Transport Hartford for hosting the conference.
Thank you so much, Congressman, for your remarks, and truly appreciate the time that you took to come to speak to us. It's very, very kind of you. Maybe Randal, do you want to, or sorry, who want to speak in next? We'll just have some different message in the chat here. Well, it appears to be that Kevin and Mike are going to go ahead. So, sorry, Mike is FHI and Kevin from DOT, and Mark and Kevin have been working on this Greater Hartford Mobility Study. And we can hear how you engage and what the process and what the outcome and what you learned through this study. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. As we talk about the importance of public involvement, I think we might want to start back when it wasn't considered as so important. As the Congressman mentioned, some 50 years ago, when I-84 was first built, decision makers did what they thought was best with little or no community input or how projects would impact them. Soon after that, environmental laws were put in place that did help protect the community, but they were not always, the community wasn't always satisfied with the department's outreach or feel that we had much of a real partnership. So then around 10 years ago, when the elevated portion of I-84 were in need of repair, the community challenged us to do more than just fix the bridge, but to address the divisions created by the highway. So the department took up this challenge with the I-84 project. We made considerable effort to build a better relationship with the community by involving them in the process, which included the creation of a public advisory committee, several day-long and even multi-day open planning studios, various focus group meetings, and monthly visits to the local NRZ, and even meeting in people's living rooms. The project benefited from this in a number of ways. The first is, that we really included reaching a good consensus around a solution. In fact, one of the best performing solutions you see here in the lower highway alternative was really inspired by community input with suggestion for moving the rail line so the highway could be lowered. And then there was many other suggestions that were incorporated in more subtle ways. And even when there was a suggestion that wasn't always practical, it did continue to inspire a thought from the project team and find solutions that could also be done. Another thing this process demonstrated was how intertwined the many transportation issues are, including the influence of the I-84-91 interchange, the rail, Connecticut Transit, CT Fast Track, East Coast Greenway, and a number of the different local streets of all modes. And it became obvious that the only way to really address these concerns and avoid solving the problems in isolation was to pull back from the focus on the viaduct repair and look at the big picture. We've done this by creating the Hartford Mobility Study. This study uses a process that's, in the conventional planning approach. As I mentioned, when you looked at those different elements, when we looked at them in silos, as sometimes traditionally has been done, it didn't really address the interconnectivity. So what we're doing now is looking at in a comprehensive planning approach and looking at the very different perspectives. And then when the problems are solved, they're also supporting the modes between the modes. And these solutions will support each other. And this is important to keep the different perspectives involved. And Mike is gonna go a little further into the details of how the important public involvement helps with this comprehensive approach.
Thanks, Kevin. I think what, Kevin talked about the history of involvement at the department level. And what we want to stress is that we're looking for meaningful input. Public involvement shouldn't be something that you just add on to the project or a check the box feature. It's certainly something that should shape the planning and make the outcomes the best outcomes possible. So we've been talking with regional stakeholders, those that they will have a significant say in the recommendations that get put forth, as well as public and a diversity of public from the very neighborhood level to transportation advocates to people who use the transportation system to get to and from work, and most importantly, to communities that oftentimes don't have a strong voice in the planning process, and that's the environmental justice communities. We are working really hard to try to incorporate the viewpoints of everybody. Obviously, during COVID, we had to start out doing things virtual, but we're moving into a much more in-person phase of the project, and that's going to only accelerate, fingers crossed, in 2022. So just starting with the stakeholders, we've been speaking one-on-one with a multitude of regional interests, from business leaders, academia, healthcare, the construction industry, economic development, emergency response, clergy, transport leaders. So it's a wide variety of input that we've been taking so far. And I just wanted to give you a little snippet, some visual representation of some of the things we've been hearing from these stakeholders. We talked with everybody just about their preferences. Kevin had alluded to a number of projects that are certainly out there and have been studied for years. And one of the first things we wanted to know is really how people feel, all right, about these various things. Now, the darker the blue is the more preference or the more likes we've got for various things, whereas the orange is sort of the dislike. So we've grouped these into the modes of highway transit by PED. And the way that we've been interpreting this feedback is that there's a lot of differentiation with what to really do with a highway system. But I think most everybody wants congestion relief, understands that congestion relief, as the congressman said, is really unlocking this chokehold that congestion has on this region, both for freight and for people who use the highway system. But how that congestion relief happens seems to be split among a bunch of different things. Now, there are a number of stakeholders that really believe that new highway capacity is needed. There's a variety of ways to do that. But the underlying messages we've been getting are that people are relatively agnostic to really what we do with the highway, as long as we put something back that reconnects the fabric of the city back together, that connects those neighborhoods that Congressman Larson has been alluding to, the North End and other neighborhoods that have been split up by this highway. So that's really what we're taking from the highway discussion. But what there's a lot of alignment with is the upgrade of rail service, of the extensions of fast track, of making sure those last mile connections between transit stations and destinations and employers is made so that people can get from a train or a bus, walk, bike, or get there in other ways. There's also a real strong preference for safe streets that include bicycle networks, better sidewalks and pedestrian crossings. The East Coast Greenway is a very popular amenity that people would like to see come through the area. So there's a lot of real strong alignment we're getting from our stakeholder conversations. We also try to pull out some of the sentiments regarding, what other motivations surround the mobility side of this project. And I think overall, what we're hearing is that economic development is the means to the end, right? So mobility is important, but looking at it from an economic development lens is extremely important. Whether that's transit-oriented development or corridor and infill development, that's kind of the motivating force behind all this, as well as access to the waterfront. Almost everybody you're going to hear from today is going to talk about Hartford's relationship with the river. The other thing that was sort of noteworthy was that a lot of people do understand that technology is rapidly accelerating and that there may be technologies in the future that will help us change the way we think about providing mobility as a service. And so we want to be really mindful of that in our planning. In terms of challenges, almost everybody cited the cost of the program. The magnitude of the program is massive. There's a lot of needs out there. There's only so much money. This infrastructure package is great, it gets us going in the right direction, but there's certainly going to be the need for more as this thing develops into the future. The other items that were of concern were just the possibility of impacts, both to communities and businesses during any kind of major construction cycles. So we have to do things in a way that minimize those impacts and actually do better in terms of sort of, again, restitching some of those neighborhoods that have been disconnected and neglected over the years. This is really busy, but what I want to say here is that we've been reaching out to thousands and thousands of people in the public realm. Their comments and feedback mirror very closely what we're hearing from our regional stakeholders. There's a real strong sentiment to improve local transportation, kind of at the street level, the bus systems, the times of service of operation, how people can walk and move about in other ways other than automobiles, but also to make things safer and remove congested bottlenecks throughout the region. So this feedback was taken all together along with technical analysis to come up with a universe of alternatives. This is something that's going to be released to the public in a few weeks. We've gotten over 240 individual ideas that were generated from public feedback alone. We've included obviously projects that have been initiated in other studies and new ideas as well from our technical analysis. And what we're going to be looking to do now is sort of vet these through more public process to get an understanding of which of these projects that people want to see advanced. We're going to have to do a lot of technical analysis on this to kind of filter through and pick the highest performing options. But this is something that you're going to be able to weigh in on in the very near future. And I could talk more about the process, but I think I'd like to hear from Randal and Jackie and their perspectives. And then, if there's time for Q&A, we can circle back on how we intend to sort of distill all this information and come up with a sort of more finite list of solutions.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Really appreciate your slides and the feedback on your research. Randal, the floor is yours on
Yes.
the view from the city.
Good afternoon. My name is Randal Davis, Deputy Director at the Department of Development Services here in the city of Hartford. And before I was with the city, I got to work closely with Kevin over at the Department of Transportation. So I'm familiar with a lot of the work that they did previously during the 8 years that I was there, and have also worked and collaborated with Jackie. Let me start at the very top by saying I want to acknowledge and thank all of the work and advocacy done by Congressman Larson. It's extremely important. The city is completely supportive of making large infrastructure investments in the city of Hartford, which will have a tremendously positive impact on the region at large. Let me just start at a very high level overview. Then the other thing I wanted to say, which I'll drill down into the question that you kind of posed about public engagement. Let me start by saying on this call, many of you will know, but not necessarily all of you, you have myself, a representative of the city, you have Congressman Larson, who represents the state, but at the federal level, Kevin and Mike speaking for the city, and Jackie Mandyck speaking for a large social organization here in the city of Hartford. And as I stated at the beginning, we have all collaborated over the years on these large projects. And one of the things that we have done both individually but collaboratively is to figure out how we get information from the public. As Kevin mentioned when he began talking, that wasn't necessarily how it was always done, but there was definitely a large shift from the state perspective, about 8 or 9 years ago, to make once it was raised that that the state needed to do more, and the state rose to that occasion. Similarly, the city was engaged very collaboratively with the department over the last 5 to 7 years to make sure that our residents participated in many of these meetings. As Mike referred to, the state, in coordination with the city, held 75 public meetings with regard to some of the big infrastructure projects like I-84 and CT Fast Track to get the public input. And that public input did shape the conversation, bring up new ideas so that we can get to ultimately a better product for everyone that is here. So I say that to say that, a city is only its people. That is the important thing. So the voices of the people are important. But let me also say, referring to transportation specifically, transportation is the bedrock of all economic development. And I think one of the comments that Congressman Larson made that was very important was he said, I believe he used the word thoughtful. And I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about the engagement of the public.
No, it's just yet another one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is when we're talking about the public.
I gotta close it. Just 1 sec.
Is to ensure that we don't miss that step, and to ensure that we are building the best products by making sure, and the best programs, that by making sure that everyone's voice has been heard. Because there are some things at a high level that you might miss that you won't know unless you actually talk to the people who are being directly impacted. For instance, where the CT Fast Track stops go, you need to know who lives there and how it's going to impact their daily commute. And that's why those conversations are very important, not just at the theoretical at an academic level, but also at the level of, hey, here's what we're thinking. How does this impact you? So the city is also very committed to those conversations. And as Congressman Larson talked about, the city is very committed to restitching some of the damage that was done when some of our larger programs, such as the I-84, were built, and it didn't have that public engagement that we are looking, that we've been doing in the last 10 years a lot, and certainly that we hope to continue to do more of in the years to come. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to Jackie and look forward to the continued discussion.
Thank you so much, Randal. I really appreciate it. Again, my name is Jackie Mandyck. I'm the executive director of the I-Quilt Partnership. The I-Quilt Partnership started about 14 years ago, and we were established as a downtown redevelopment think tank process. Worked very closely with Kevin when he was the city of Hartford, Randal when he was at DOT, on many different projects. We've expanded over the last several years into a project called Hartford 400, which really looks at what can the region, being having the city as the center focus, but what can the region accomplish by the time Hartford turns 400 years old, which is in 2035. So we're really looking at expanding that mode and that model about how do we look at some short-term successes for not only Hartford for the region, but also for the region. And then also how do we look at some very long-term, or hopefully not very long-term, but long-term projects that can really be transformative in several different areas. As we look at Hartford 400, we look at 4 or 5 main principles with Hartford 400. We look at, how do we make our environment, or how do we make our communities more sustainable, more green? How do we grow? So what is our economic development? How do we look at community engagement? And how do we do that in a very equitable way? How do we move? So how is our transportation infrastructure set up? Everything from walking to getting a bus, train, plane, and private automobile. And then how do we play? So what does vibrancy look at it? So when we look at the Greater Hartford Mobility Study or other projects such as this that we've been focusing on now for the last several years, we're really trying to put on several different lenses in our glasses. And we're trying to look at it through all of those to see what can we do? How can we not look at this as just a transportation project? And I think it's very important from our perspective. We are solving some of the issues that the Greater Hartford Mobility Study is looking at is how to solve some transportation issues. So we've got, an older aging infrastructure. We're trying to solve congestion in our capital city and in other locations, not just our capital city, but in East Hartford and some other areas around. But how do we not just solve a problem, but how do we think creatively? And how do we start to look at what else can we get done in the meantime? What are some creative add-ons that can happen when we need to do this? How can we design, develop, look at these things in a much more comprehensive way, looking through all those lenses, the sustainability, how we live nowadays, how we start to move, and especially the economy. Several people on the panel today have mentioned about getting back to the river and being able to have that access. And that is very, very important to us. As we've all learned over the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, our quality of place where we all live is extremely important. And those transformative projects that we see coming down the pike, those will enhance our Greater Hartford region. This isn't just about a project in the city of Hartford. This involves many municipalities. It involves those people who visit our state, live in our region, but also travel through our region as well. So we need to look at all of those in a comprehensive way. And what we've done is many of the other panelists, both the city and the Greater Hartford Mobility Study, is we're asking a lot of questions to a lot of people. One of the things as a private nonprofit, we're able to go ahead and we're able to say to state DOT, hey, we have ideas. Here's our big idea. And we've kind of looked at different ways. In the beginning stages, according to some federal regulations, they have to stay a little neutral on things where we can push forth an agenda. So we're here to try and push forth some ideas and make sure that those voices are heard. And I'm not sure who I'm supposed to turn it back over to at this point.
Well,
Thomas,
Jackie, I happen to be the moderator. So here we go. Great. Thank you so much for all this discussion. It's of course great to hear from all of you. I'm very curious to hear from the very panelists, but if any of you actually watched the video from Sarita Reynolds, the keynote speaker from Los Angeles, and she was highlighting her work, which was to create this very integrated dialogue, constant with the communities, where she will say, well, this is some money for your community. What would you like to do with it? Rather than doing stuff for consultation and powers and so on. So, and I have a question for Randal here is the city open to creating some? I know they have the NRZs and so on, but to have some integrated board for communities where they could actually decide where the investment goes, taking ownership of the project in a much more integrated ways that it is now.
So you pose a relatively large question, Thomas, and I say that in the following sense. And for those of you out there who may not be as familiar with some of the funding, and by funding, I'm talking about where the money comes from. So when a city like Hartford is doing an infrastructure project with funding that comes from the state, sometimes from the federal government, sometimes through state bonding, or sometimes from actual city dollars. And that does have an impact on the requirements that we're required to go through as we set up and begin a project. To your point, our NRZs, we're extraordinarily active with them. One of my directors staffs 3 of the NRZs, which means that every single NRZ meeting, we actually have a staff person there to provide information to them, to get feedback from them. And we use them as a jumping off point when we're doing public engagement for our various projects, whether it's a streetscape project or whether it is a more construction-centric project from our DPW. We actually go out and have public meetings where there's public dialogue to determine what is your perspective on what we're going to do. So we actually do that currently to some degree. And as you know, there's what is referred to as the Capital Regional Council of Governments. They do have some say in terms of how some of the state and federal dollars get spent and which priority and which town they get spent in out of their 30 plus member cities. So certainly the city always wants to be open and listening to the public. I think how it's structured is important, right? Because we always, as public officials, we have state and federal guidelines that we have to meet. So I will say, for instance, one of the things is something referred to as an EIS, environmental impact study. Depending on the size of a project, these are things that we are required by law to go out, which involves a direct communication to the public as well as investigation on what the impacts of a project will be. So this is stuff that we do on a regular basis. I think what you're saying is, how is it more formalized than it already is? I think that's what your question is. Am I mistaken?
Yeah, but kind of. I mean, this is yes and no. Yes, I mean, there's I think an opportunity for board and and I mean, NRZs don't decide where investment go. No, they don't. Overview project in a way that what our speaker in Los Angeles was speaking about earlier on. So maybe it's a question for DOT. Well, so to what extent the DOT can sorry, go ahead, Randal.
Just before, I will say, so when you're talking about setting priorities, so every 10 years, the cities, all cities in the state of Connecticut are required to do a POCD, which is Conservation Development Document, in which the one that we did now was referred to as, I believe, Hartford 2035, which is the 400th anniversary of Hartford. And during that process, there were, I was one of the panelists in one of the groups, which had about 30 people, was for transportation and included local residents, to actually figure out the high-level items that we as a city want to focus on. That document ultimately ended up developing 10 transformative project areas in the city of Hartford. So there is a document that we work from that started with conversation that, in this case, it included people that were specialists in the area, but it also included the public from the city of Hartford, where these things would be, where they would directly impact them. I was on the transportation panel. There were probably 15 people who work in transportation and probably another 10 or 15 local people who attended that meeting regularly for about 2.5 or 3 months before the report was done. And that is the document that the city uses to drive some of its investment, both whether it's transportation or development. So there is a document for that that was generated with public input.
Yes, thank you. And I was talking about this formally and informally, in the sense of Celeta was talking about how her city, Los Angeles, can actually raise money from philanthropic funds and use it in a much more with fewer norms, fewer constraints that you require when you use DOT money or federal money. Kevin and Jackie, do you or Mike, do you want to add anything on this discussion?
Well, when there's a couple different ways that you think how money gets spent. One, the department is a custodian of quite a bit of infrastructure, and that stuff we want to keep in a state of good repair to start with. So obviously we have a process that we look at different performance measures to see that the roads are still performing and traffic signals are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then we look to maintain those performance measures through investment. And then as we look at needs from these performance measures, then we'll look at to do new projects. And I think this might be a good point, maybe Mike, to kind of go through a little bit of that other part of the process slide that talks a little bit how we're going to be using a process that uses these performance metrics and some of the other is a little bit more complicated here that Mike, I think, can start talking you through this this process slide. This is kind of particular to the mobility study.
Yeah, there's kind of 3 points, and everything that Randal said and Kevin followed up with is 100% accurate with how we work involvement into this process. And I just want to stress that it is a process, and sometimes I know that's frustrating for people to hear, but we do have some requirements that dictate how we move through the evaluation of alternatives and how do we get to an outcome. So the piece on the left, the process piece, is we're at the universe of alternative stage. There's a lot of them. There's over 100 of them. We're obviously not going to be able to support and invest in 100 different things because some of these things actually are complementary and some of them compete. For example, there could be a corridor with a highway and a rail investment. They might both serve the same need. We might not be able to do both of them. So we need to technically screen out one or the other, figure it out. And it's not just from a mobility perspective. We have to think about it from an economic development, an equity perspective, an environmental perspective. And then we really have to pick those alternatives that have the highest utility, right? And then on the other side, we're going to have a bunch of complementary alternatives, those that work well together. I mentioned earlier in the presentation, last mile connectivity. You can't build a high-performing, efficient, effective bus service without having strong last mile connections to destinations. So those things work together. So we're in the process in the next several months to try to figure out how to screen down the 100+ alternatives down to something more manageable. Then they have to be put into a set of programs. And those programs are going to be defined by time frame. Some are going to be nearer term, some midterm, some long term, as well as how to maximize their effectiveness and synergistic relationships by packaging them together in a way that gets the most bang for the buck. And then, of course, there'll be a program that has some kind of a funding filter put on it. So we'll take our best guess of, really how much funding we'll have over the next couple decades. Like I said, this infrastructure bill gets us in the right direction, but there's going to need to be more over time. And then the next piece of the process, which I think is very interesting, is we're going to look at these through the lens of future scenarios. So this is another place where public input's needed. What are those future scenarios? We already see behavior change, right, as a result of the COVID pandemic. People are working from home more. Travel patterns have been altered. Will they be altered forever? We don't know. We think to a degree they will. But we may have to think about a future where there is a much higher degree of sort of discretionary work, commute travel. People may be going to cities for different purposes. It may be more recreational in nature. So that could be a scenario. I mentioned technology earlier. Technology could drive a lot of how we think about the future. Land use could change. For years, people have been moving back into cities. COVID has, at least temporarily, caused people to move out of cities. So what is the land use composition in terms of density and location? That could have a big factor onto where we build transportation. And then policies. We can set policies that can drive change. So we're gonna work with the public and with our stakeholders to understand what scenarios we could test in the future. We're gonna run all of our programs through those. This way, the outcome hopefully will result in a package of investments that have the most sustainability over time, that have the most they sort of resist the tendency to fail if some sort of scenario in the future changes. And then the decision-making lens. I think everybody's talked about this. It's not going to be just the DOT. DOT is a partner with a lot of state and federal agencies, including DECD and DEP. But of course, at the local level, at the city of Hartford, with advocacy groups, like like Jackie's and many others. There's going to be a lot of discussion over really how to take this information that we're presenting from this process and start to break out early action items, things we have money for now, things that don't need a high level of environmental review, and then those really longer term things that we might not have money for now. And these might be the big aspirational projects that we all know we need, but we're going to need some circuit breakers in the process, because if we start tracking over time and notice that something starts to happen that we didn't expect, we want to make sure we can pivot and reprioritize if necessary. So, you know, it's a long way of saying, you know, we've got a lot of process we have to follow, but we are going to be interjecting public and stakeholder involvement in every step of the way, so that everybody has a say. And hopefully, you know, this planning is going to be a large degree guided by that input. So I'll stop sharing this now.
Great, thank you so much for that. So we are getting this infrastructure bill, and Congressman Larson was talking about it. I think one of his first words was where we have all these choke points in Connecticut, and this infrastructure bill is going to be able to address those and so on. So I mean, so the question is for you at DOT and planners and so on, is are the decisions already made in what is going to be, even if there is some study and some survey and so on where the money is going to be spent. And if you're talking about choke points, is I'm sure you're aware of the debate that if we try to address choke point and widening highways, it does not reduce pollution. It does increase pollution by increasing the amount of cars which are traveled and so on. So there is this back and forth here between some of the advocates and some who are involved in infrastructure design. So I mean, so more basically, so what are you expecting from the infrastructure plan? Jackie, you've been working on the Hartford 400 project. Do you think you're going to be able to does the amount of money that Hartford or the Greater Hartford region can get can actually meet the demands that your project require? Anyway, so that's a few choke points, and then infrastructure hopes.
You know, Thomas, you bring up a great point as far as you have to factor in some costs into this equation, but I think you also have to factor in the opportunity cost here as well. So, you know, if you don't do certain things, what do you lose economically, transformatively? What the state of Connecticut is doing right now will impact our region for the next 100 years. As you can see, this is once in a lifetime opportunity for many of us for what is happening at the state of Connecticut right now as far as the Greater Hartford Mobility Study. So we have to look at this with a very long-term strategy, where we want to go, where we think things are going, but where we also want to go. So I think we cannot underestimate what do we lose by not putting the money where we need it to be right now to be a very transformative project. So it just can't be about today's costs. It's got to be about the future.
And Thomas, if I could just add, I think I agree with everything Jackie said. I think with regard to highway capacity, you know, there are people looking at it in a couple of different ways. I think there is a lot of agreement with a lot of new highway capacity as being something that isn't desirable because of that latent demand that you did talk about. But we have a system right now that was designed, like Kevin said, it was built 50 years ago, it was designed 60 plus years ago for a different time. And we are not seeing the capacity in the current system that was envisioned because of just how much traffic uses it, because of the inefficiencies of how highway ramp and geometry was at the time. When you have a 3-lane highway that's choked down to 2 lanes because of a bridge, what we're seeing is the capacity should be higher, but it can't because it's getting choked down, it's getting funneled. And You know, I know that congestion is oftentimes a motivation to get other forms of transportation better utilized, like buses and trains and other non-motorized modes. But there is a certain dysfunction that we certainly have on a lot of our highways around the region that I think if we can make some targeted investments, we can go a long way to just smoothing out the flow and making things safer, because these areas not only are congested, they're unsafe, a lot of crashes. And that's problematic because, you know, there's a whole series of non-recurrent delay that we see every single day, you know, based on these crashes because of substandard highway geometry. So I think there's a mix, and a lot of people are in agreement with the fact that, you know, a lot of new highway capacity could just generate a lot more car traffic, but we could also probably selectively, you know, improve some of the existing freeways, and certainly make them a lot more friendly to the environment that surrounds them.
And I just wanted to add on to their comments. I agree with all of them. And I think what is important, and Kevin may comment on this as well, you know, it is a lot of money, but as I mentioned earlier at the top of the statement, Hartford itself is going to be 400 years old soon. The state is an old state. We have some of the oldest bridges in the state as well as movable bridges. So there's billions of dollars of work that has not been done. So although we're getting a lot of money, you know, there has to be thoughtfulness to it. That said, Hartford is certainly chief among those things in terms of, as Jackie said it so eloquently, the opportunity cost. One of the studies that was just completed recently had to do with the disinvestment in rail between Boston and Springfield, and the fact that that has a direct impact on actually the Hartford and Springfield region, to the tune of, and I may say this wrong, I think the study said, you know, with $7 billion of investment, there was something around $47 billion of economic input, you know, expected within the first 10 years, and far more access to jobs and things of that nature. So although it seems like a lot of money, as Mike said, it is a step in the right direction. We need our local residents and local politicians, and of course, as John Larson has done, to continue to advocate for future funds as well.
Yeah, you know, as they all the panelists have said, you know, this is something that part of what the study is looking at is to have enough of a roadmap ahead for the different options and balance those to different needs that we have, both in the as Mike spoke to about some of these changes that we have, old infrastructure that has some things that could be improved safety-wise, are things where, yes, there is some demand that we have to not overbuild, but those choke points do create their own environmental concern as well. And that this will have to be something that's going to be phased over time. If we look at this whole universe of alternatives, it is going to be a huge amount, but there are things that we can do at different scales, things we can do right away, things we can start doing that will lead to the bigger things as well.
Great, thank you so much all for this. Any questions? I mean, from you, the audience. You can raise your hand. You can ask questions in the chat.
Well, okay. I'll just make because you did have a couple of chats, and I did see someone referred to I-81 in Syracuse, and I can tell you that I think Mike and Kevin are both aware that when the state of Connecticut was looking, or I should say the DOT in particular, at the I-84 viaduct project, they certainly looked at that project, and one of the alternatives involves both lowering the viaduct in Hartford, but separate from that, as you look at the larger potential of universe of options, potentially moving the I-84, I-91 interchange and reclaiming our historic bridge as a road rather than a highway. So the state of Connecticut, DOT certainly has looked at other projects that are similar and has brought that back to their public advisory committee in the past to discuss those things as they try to figure out what are good options for our area.
Great, thank you. Any question? I have more questions, but if you can raise your hand or in the chat. Well, I have a question. If there's nobody question, is this? I mean, how some of these grants which are going to come are going to be competitive, and you're going to have to compete against all the region and so on and so on. What do you think how do you what makes you think that you're going to be successful in attracting those grants?
I'm going to go for state DOT for a second in the city, Thomas. I mean, I think with all three of our entities or organizations, there's been a huge amount of public outreach to chat with people, not only in the city of Hartford, but the region. And I think, we're in a state where, as Congressman Larson brought up a lot of our current situation, that, we fit very, very well into a lot of different categories, different priorities that the current administration is trying to address right now. And I think, with some coordination and with people hopping on the train, no pun intended, that I think we have a very good chance of getting some significant funding to this region, because we're very important to New England. We're extremely important to the Northeast. And I think that any dollar invested in this area right now will definitely bring back much, much more in the benefits that we reap at the end.
Yeah, I think Jackie's right. And, this is why we plan, right? So when we had that last big round of sort of infrastructure funding, everything had to be shovel ready was the term, right? And so we got a lot of pavement projects and things like that, because those were the ones that had construction bid documents ready to go. Well, now, what the government's looking for is they're looking for plan that's supported, that's well thought out, that's considered the environment, that's considered social justice. We're doing all of that. So I think having this plan is going to put the state in a good position to start to look for those competitive grant opportunities with the support of the city, of I-Quilt, of congressmen and others, other legislators. I think Connecticut could be in a good position, but we've got to get through this process and document things well and be transparent about it.
And if I could just add, I agree with both Jackie and Mike. I think it's a matter of we have all the boxes that the federal government wants to be checked. And that doesn't, I don't mean to sound that in a negative sense, checked in the sense that many of these large programmatic items, things that the federal government is doing, ultimately it's about jobs creation and economic growth. And this region, as Jackie already said, we've had this in the past where we had a lot more rail and we were a much more thriving in terms of economically as a region. This disinvestment has impacted us. So it's not even an experiment. We're pretty sure that if we put the investment back in, the dollars will come back. So for those reasons, because we will be meeting the goals and objectives of the federal government with our investments, I think that's why we as a region will be successful. And also when you look at this panel and even going as Congressman Larson talked about, Congressman Neal, there's a great deal of support for investment in public infrastructure, particular public transportation. So I think regionally speaking, we're very well poised for that. And we have there, and the state has a great team working on it.
Thank you. And here we have Paul, who raised his hand. Go ahead, Paul.
Hi, this is Paul Ashworth. I'm a resident of Hartford. My question is for Mr. Morehouse. I appreciate you taking the time to address the people who may have concerns about highway expansion, in particular because of environmental concerns or because there's that induced demand idea where as soon as you allow for more people to use it, more people will use it simply because they can and because it's convenient. But you said that there are times when you can increase capacity or fix something on a highway that allows more people to use it, and there's an environmental benefit from that. I wish you would drill down on that a little bit more, because I've just never seen a way that works out. Thank you.
Well, I think I said a safety benefit. Right now we've got some lane drops. If heading along I-84 east, when you have Route 91 ramps to the north and south, and you're stuck in that lane and you don't want to go there, and people are weaving across a couple lanes of traffic to get there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of poor geometry, which is creating a lot of the congestion. It's not the fact that it's there's not enough lanes, really. It's just how those lanes are configured, and that's causing a lot of problems. So what I was trying to get at, my point, and I apologize if I didn't articulate this well, is that capacity could be looked at a couple of different ways. There's the maybe, I won't say the wrong way and the right way, but the way that a lot of people discourage because of the induced demand argument you made is just adding another lane. You know, it's kind of what you see they do down in South Texas is a good example. You know, California's been a problem forever. They just keep adding lane after lane after lane, and of course they fill up. I think the state has been very careful to look selectively at, okay, well, what's causing real high crash probability? And you know, they're looking at those left-hand on and offs, they're looking at the lane drops, they're looking at the tight curvature going through the highway and saying, how can we maybe fix these problems, sort of recapture the capacity that was lost to bad design, and at the same time, try to make things better for the surrounding city environment. And that's what I think I-84 Hartford was successful in doing. I think we demonstrated that we could lower that highway, bury parts of it, bridge the neighborhoods back together, soften the curvature, fix the left-hand on and offs, and you know, make that highway safer and smoother without adding actually extra general purpose lanes. So that was the point I just tried to make on that.
I think Thomas left for a second, so I'm going to go ahead and take over for a second. Oh, no, Thomas, if it's okay with you, I think one of the things that maybe we can all address a little bit more about is, you know, at this point in time, as we're all working with our different hats on, like, how do people still engage with this process? Like, how do they get in touch with us? How can they learn more about whatever we're doing? You know, how, you know, where is the best bang for their buck as far as them being a part of this process? I asked the question, so you guys get to answer this one first.
Were you going to start with that, Kevin?
I missed the end because I was reading a comment at the same time, which was a bad move.
I think Jackie is talking about this. One of them correctly is priority and cost effectiveness, right?
Yes.
And I think on that, I mean, we had this incredible PR saying about we need to build roundabout everywhere. There's this piece in New York Times a few days ago. And it's becoming, we know that the Garrett Ucalito from DOT is a roundabout fan. But anyway, so are we talking about, you know, novelty infrastructure design like roundabout, which are pretty rare here in this part of the world, or is doing what the DOT has been doing, but in an updated way?
Well, I mean, as we look at the entire universe that Mike was talking about, it's a wide variety of different things in overall the different modes. So we are looking at some things, and we've gotten things that we've gotten from public input that has been again, runs the gamut from whether it's going to be bike facilities or roundabouts or highway things. So I think that we are looking at a number of different ways to look at all the problems. And we start with going down to those specific needs. We did an extensive, which I will be, if it's not up, it will be posted shortly, is our existing conditions survey, which talks about a lot of the different needs mobility-wise and what that supports. And then we've looked at identifying a number of projects that are going to meet those needs, and then going to what Mike showed you before, going through that funnel and looking at the projects that either are competing because of the type of problem they solve or the geography in which they are trying to solve it. And then ones that can be complementary and add on, just like we talked about earlier in our presentation about how we want to see these projects work together. and build upon each other. I hope I kind of got to what the question was.
Yes, and Randal, for you at the city, what is the type of investment that has the best cost benefit ratio?
Well, again, I think it's a big question, as Kevin alluded to, because there's so many different aspects of what can be done in these extraordinarily large projects. And as Jackie said earlier, when we think about some of the large projects in the city of Hartford, which impact the entire region, they are not just highway projects. They are projects that are transformative and will impact people's lives on a daily basis, people that live in the city, people that work in the city, people that pass through the city. So to your point, to your question, it is really a matter of trying to figure out how to balance all of that, right? In terms of what can we get first? That one of the first things that is truly important to the city is restitching the city. And I try not to get too granular, but as an old city, the city of Hartford it's a small city, and it has a very unique footprint in terms of where cars can go. Manhattan is a big city, but they can literally close streets down because of the grid system. So that's a kind of a granular example, but there has to be thoughtful conversation in terms of how we do all of that so that we can continue to keep the city vibrant, and at the same time and make it more vibrant by restitching the city from some of the damage that was done by the highways in particular. So that is a paramount importance, but right along with restitching the city, as we've all talked about, it is about making the capital more regionally accessible through better train service, and as Congressman Larson talked about, even increased or expanded service at Bradley. We are very unique in the region in terms of the price point and cost to live in the central region of Connecticut when you compare it to a Boston or New York. But we're also one of the most educated regions in the country. So we have talent and ability here. So I think it is not one thing or another. It's a combination of all of them. And I'll go back to the ID4, just that one project. It was 3 years of meetings. I don't know what you say, Kevin. They were bi-monthly of the Public Advisory Committee, which included 40 or 50 groups, including major employers, people that lived and worked in the city, people that bike and walk in the city, to actually come up with some of those alternatives. So it's not one thing. It's a long process that people should stay involved in over time.
Let me answer this maybe another way too, or add on to what was saying. You know, Hartford is an old city. It's got an old street network. It's got a lot of confluences where multiple roads sort of cross at acute angles. It's very challenging to get around. There's not a lot of parallel network that some other cities are fortunate enough to have. So there are problems right off the bat. However, you know, when I mentioned before the scenario planning aspect of this, we need to think about the position Hartford is going to play in our region 5, 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now, right? Because we may be in a situation where that traditional peak hour demand for everybody trying to get to their offices by 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning and leave by 4 or 5 isn't there anymore. And it's more distributed throughout the day and for other purposes, not just work, but recreation, so shopping, dining, the arts. So all those things that Hartford currently has and could have more of. So if we're not, and so this project is thinking beyond the conventional level of service performance metrics that I'm sure many of you on this call are aware of. It's really sort of pretty old traffic engineering, methodology, but it doesn't work really well in cities. And we know it can be actually detrimental to cities. But there's always been a strong motivation to try to accommodate that surge of traffic in the morning and the afternoon. Let's say we don't have to do as much of that. And we're seeing that now. I mean, traffic is coming back, but the morning peak hour is definitely a lot flatter than it's ever been. So instead of designing for the highest hour of the day, maybe we can think differently about using different key performance indicators that stress reliability and quality of service and the degree of block lengths. And there's a lot of different urban design metrics. Jackie, I'm sure you guys have used a lot of those in your planning that we can start to think about that could really yield some really low-hanging fruit. And we use that term internally in our project team a lot because some of these investments are relatively low cost, don't require a whole lot of planning or environmental review, a relatively small amount of money, but could yield huge dividends, especially when they're sort of incrementally built upon with lots of other things like bus service improvements and those last mile connectivity and bike lanes, things that the city's already working hard at. But this project could help accelerate some of that planning and certainly incorporate that in our system-wide approach to thinking about overall mobility, not just saying, okay, it's a highway solution or a rail solution. Those are the things the state's responsible for, but how to augment those big aspirational visions with the smaller low-hanging fruit projects that could really make those things the most effective they can be.
Great. Thank you. We have some questions from Adam in the chat. He's talking about the ramps. It's something we hear often say, how about, instead of trying to add more lanes, let's put some ramps. I mean, anybody who took some Moderator, there's a ramp every half mile, more or less. So, I mean, is this something that you are also considering? There's multiple ways to go into Hartford from the highways and the big ramps. We even have some ramps that go nowhere at some point. So anyway, so it is something that you're considering in your various studies and surveys.
Right, absolutely. Even when we were doing the I-84 the study, we looked at a number of things that we thought would be early action items, and we're also pulling them forward into this mobility study. So, again, probably correct, they might have more ramps than we need, but important to that is that to see that the local road system around it supports the mobility along there, and sometimes that wasn't the case, and so people are jumping on the highway to go places because they're not finding their way on the local road network as well as they'd like to.
Yeah, I've never met a highway engineer who wanted closer, poorly spaced ramping. They want the highway to flow efficiently. The problem that we often see, though, is that you suggest closing a ramp, and then all of a sudden traffic gets diverted through neighborhoods which nobody likes, or you lose traffic in front of businesses that relied on it. And I know there's lots of arguments around all of that, but Hartford doesn't have the best network to get some of that traffic moving around, and so there will be fears that traffic will divert. That doesn't always come to fruition, and I know some of you can point to lots of examples where highways came down or ramps were closed and that didn't happen. But those are real concerns that people have whenever there's any kind of discussion about eliminating ramps.
I think Michael brings up a great point. And I think one of the things that I'd just like everybody to think about too, if you look at, for those of you who aren't very familiar with the city of Hartford, think about it this way. You cannot cross over our river without getting on an interstate highway. So if you think about that, if I'm just going from Hartford to East Hartford, if I'm in downtown Hartford and I want to get to Main Street in East Hartford, I have to get on an interstate highway. If we look at what the demand in both the highway and the ramps that we need and don't need, if we had a local road, as I believe a road that Randal brought up beforehand that gets us across the river, what does that actually do to our traffic? What would that do to minimize our crash? What would that do as far as pulling some of the need for some of those on and off ramps if we had, a bridge that could get us just over the river and was considered a local road and not getting on an interstate highway? I think important improvements like that, once we put that in, I'm not going to, but Michael will and Kevin will, when they put that kind of numbers into the analysis, I really wonder what kind of numbers we're going to get crossing. If you had a road that went across the river, what kind of numbers would you be able to decrease on those interstate highways, and how much how many ramps could we get rid of, even just by adding something like that? So I think, trying to be creative, trying to look at those different types of things will be very, very important as the state and the Greater Hartford Mobility Study move forward. And by the way, Randal, I just want to mention, I love the way that you're talking very I-Quilt with your restitching quotes today. So I just want to let you know, I thank you very much for that.
we like the 400 plan. I mean, it's a great plan. It took a lot. It brings together a lot in a very cohesive way, and that's what Kevin's going to build for us, right?
Correct.
Thank you.
Correct.
I mean, I don't want to forget Marie Pelletier, who is going to run a panel later on the river, which very excited about. And in the chat, she asked about environmental issues. How are environmental issues especially designed to minimize changing volatility of local tributaries flowing through neighborhoods, plus the need to cultivate ecosystem benefits. Anybody wants to take the question for Mary, or Mary, do you want to come live and explain a bit more detail what you want to ask? Is Mary here?
Can I start with that? And Kevin
Mary,
probably might, or Mike might, or Jackie might want to.
I think Mary. So you just
Mary's
Mary, do you want to say a few words?
Oh, it's really just a question about green infrastructure and how, comprehensive planning really needs to include green infrastructure, especially around waterways. Not that we can't build the Ted Williams Tunnel, I think we can, but I do think that the maintenance of waterways in our neighborhoods, because the tributaries in the neighborhoods are becoming more volatile. There's pollution issues, and there'll be changes because of that. So how will your comprehensive plan is noting bicycles, buses, airplanes, but not necessarily the watershed dynamics. So how do you?
Was that question to me or to Kevin?
Anyone, how are you going to build green infrastructure into it, understanding that green infrastructure is going to be a force that you won't necessarily be able to ignore because of the flooding. And it's also a force that we need. We need water for our environment to survive and to create healthy environments for our urban neighborhoods.
Do you want me to? I'll start with because I'm the non-technical side, because Kevin would certainly have a much more full answer, I think. But I think having worked with all of them, one of the things that's important is we all understand the importance of what you're talking about, Mary. And for instance, some of the projects that DOT was doing in the city of Hartford, looking at bioswales and things like that to make sure that we don't have too much non-porous materials, to pay attention to what's really happening with the water and where it's going. So I know that something is very high on everyone's mind, especially in this region. We're very fortunate to have clean water and accessible water, which quite frankly, if you pay any attention, that's not true in every part of the country. So it's something that's very important to me personally and important to the city of Hartford. And having worked with the state, I know that it's something they're mindful, but I'll turn it over to Kevin to tell you, he can tell you how they manage it.
I know, I would say that, in some of our outreach that we've had over the past year or so, a number of different questions have come up about how we're looking at the environment. I do believe that actually as this, we roll out the universal alternatives, that is going to be one of the focus groups we're going to be looking at getting together. And certainly we can, talk to you more, Mary, about details on that, because we are kind of still at a pretty high level of that, but and we are looking at a number of different alternatives that hopefully will be helpful to the environment as a whole, air quality issues and stuff like that. But certainly we don't want to overlook we want to see one of the other things that you see in our vision statement talks about resiliency, and that goes to a number of different environmental issues. So it is in the big picture.
Thanks. Yeah, I think even if the flooding is going to happen and droughts are to prolonged droughts, and if we want to sustain the environment, you're going to have to plan for these changing waterways.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mary.
Mary, I think you bring up a great point, and I think even as connecting back to 91, we have to respect the fact that we have done a lot of damage to our natural resources in the past. And we need to look at going forward in the future. How do we not only care and nurture them again and bring them back to a state where we can all enjoy them, but that we all protect them as well. So I think that is very important. I think one of the things that, and I know we're running out of time, Thomas, but one of the things that I just wanted to mention before we sign off on this is that I think, Connecticut, Greater Hartford, I think it is time when our region, our state, goes for a really great project, that we don't just settle for an okay project to solve solutions. We deserve, our residents deserve, the people visiting our great state deserve. We need to go for something great. I'm not saying the most expensive, I'm not saying the biggest, but I'm saying we need to be creative. We need to be looking at a lot of different options, which the Greater Hartford Mobility Study is doing. And we need to select something that is not just okay. We need something that our state and our region deserves. And that's something that is sustainable, that is multifunctional, that helps us with some economic development and can really make this region transformative and grow into the future. So I just want to make sure that we understand we should not settle for just okay this time. We should settle for great.
Great point, Jackie.
All right, thank you. Any last word from the panelists or from the audience? I just want to say that if you want to see Jackie is going to run the Winterfest very soon. When is it starting? When can we start?
The free skating rink in Bushnell Park starts on Friday at 11 a.m.
Friday.
Pray for cold weather, everyone, and free skating, free skate rentals in Bushnell Park. So come one, come all.
That's awesome. Any other announcements from FHI or the city? If you want to.
We're good. Thank you, Thomas, for inviting us.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
we
it.
Appreciate it.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Valerie Fernandez. I got involved in sustainable transportation and environmental justice as a Transport Rifle Ambassador. Now I'm currently a sophomore at the Connecticut State University studying criminology and sociology to become a lawyer. I want to thank you all for attending to our summit. I am so glad that you were able to join us today in this stimulating discussion. Please let's stay in touch. You can sign up for a newsletter, you can attend to our events, and even sponsor or work with us if interested. We hope to see you around.